J.D. Vance thought he'd humiliate Africa's youngest president on live TV, but 1 minute later, Traoré exposed a secret plan to destabilize nations. Why was the truth buried for so long? And who else was involved? The beginning of power is not when they see you. It's when they believe you're always watching. In Washington, D.C., power doesn't shout. It whispers behind mahogany doors inside elevators that skip public floors over drinks no one ever photographs. And in those shadows, there's a man who knows how to breathe in silence, J.D. Vance. To most Americans, he's a rising star, clean-cut, composed, and full of conviction. A best-selling author turned senator, a man of the people who speaks like a preacher but thinks like a prosecutor. Cable news loves him. He talks of restoring American strength, reviving the moral backbone of the West, and taking a stand where it matters. But what matters and to whom is never made quite clear. In his recent speech at the Capitol Rotunda, he delivered a line that stuck with millions. The world respects only those willing to act when others hesitate. It was thunderous, patriotic, and thunderously vague. What the cameras didn't catch was the look he gave after saying it, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. Not pride, not principle, strategy. J.D. Vance doesn't just want to win. He wants to reshape the chessboard entirely, and Africa, it seems, is his next move. But nobody says Africa in public meetings. That would be too blunt, too obvious. Instead, they say emerging regions, unlocked markets, or reliable access points. At a private dinner, weeks before the Geneva summit, Vance sat at the head of a long marble table at the Metropolitan Club. No press, no public. Just men in expensive suits with dry smiles and very quiet voices. Oil executives, data giants, defense consultants. There were no formal documents passed, but eyes met, nods exchanged. And J.D., with a whiskey glass in one hand and a pen in the other, drew a circle on a napkin. Burkina Faso, he said calmly. Unpredictable. Young leadership. Susceptible to influence or isolation. No one questioned how he knew so much. No one asked why this small West African nation, rarely in headlines, suddenly deserved attention. Because they knew it had nothing to do with democracy and everything to do with lithium, uranium, and the future of energy. J.D. wasn't new to this. In his second year in the Senate, he helped maneuver a quiet shift in the oversight of foreign development funds. That shift rerouted billions from transparent aid into third-party stabilization contractors, front groups, some say for economic leverage operations abroad. On paper, they built schools. In reality, they bought loyalty. And though no one had proven his direct involvement, strange coincidences began to pile up. African ministers who spoke out against U.S. policy mysteriously lost elections. Activist journalists were jailed for tax fraud. And in leaked cables later scrubbed from the net code names like Orchid and Maple Watch appeared in reference to cross-continental influence operations. J.D.'s private Gmail, alias Maple V17. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in politics, smoke often means fire, especially when the man near the smoke seems so calm. He never travels with more than 2 aides, never eats from the buffet line, never tweets without exact word counts. J.D. plays the long game. His silence is not ignorance, it is intent. In recent weeks, a quiet storm had been brewing across intelligence circles. Word was that J.D. Vance and his inner circle were orchestrating a strategic reshuffling in Africa, starting with nations no longer cooperating with Western military operations. Burkina Faso, now under the leadership of the defiant Ibrahim Traoré, was at the top of that list. What J.D. saw in Traoré was not a leader. It was a wild card, one that might inspire others. An inspiration to men like J.D. is dangerous. Yet Vance never raised his voice about it. He simply requested a slot at the upcoming Geneva Global Development Summit, a summit he once called ineffective diplomacy theater. So why now? Why is a man who never shows up unless he's already 3 moves ahead, suddenly eager to be on the world stage, sharing air with a 36-year-old military captain from West Africa? He smiled when asked about it in a hallway interview. It's always good to hear from new voices, he said. Some rise, some disappear. He said it like a compliment, but the weight in his tone wasn't admiration. It was a warning. And as the plane lifted from Andrews Air Force Base en route to Geneva, J.D. Vance stared out the window expressionless. Not checking emails, not rehearsing speeches, just watching the clouds drift by. Because when the plan is already in motion, all that's left is execution. Long before he wore a sash or stood behind marble podiums, Ibrahim Traoré walked barefoot through the red dust of Ouagadougou, a small city in northern Burkina Faso. His earliest memories weren't of power or politics, but of hunger. Drought seasons that felt endless. Days when school was canceled because there were no teachers. Nights when all the candles in the house were burned out, and the only light came from the fire his mother used to cook a single pot of rice. Yet even in those silent moments of scarcity, he saw something others missed. Hope. Traoré grew up with books borrowed torn, passed from cousin to cousin, books about revolutions, liberation struggles, science, history, faith. His favorite was a biography of Thomas Sankara, the slain revolutionary, who once dared to declare that, "He who feeds you controls you." Sankara had tried to break Burkina Faso free from colonial chains, only to be assassinated by those who feared such freedom. But his spirit lingered in the minds of the youth, and in young Ibrahim, it had found fertile ground. By the time he reached university, Traoré was a fierce debater and a quiet strategist. His professors called him dangerously brilliant. His classmates called him captain, not because of any military rank at the time, but because he always took the lead. When he joined the army, it wasn't for prestige. It was for proximity to understand from the inside the institutions that shaped his country's destiny. Years passed. Corruption bloomed. Terrorist cells gained ground. Foreign troops came promising order. But the soil of Burkina Faso remained soaked in blood, and its leaders grew richer while its children went missing. Then on an October morning, the world changed. Ibrahim Traoré, only 34 at the time, emerged from the shadows of command and led a bloodless coup against a regime widely viewed as a puppet of foreign interests. There were no parades, no fireworks, just a quiet speech filmed in a dark room where he looked into the camera and said, "Burkina Faso does not belong to the highest bidder, it belongs to its people." In the weeks that followed, young people flooded the streets, not in protest but in celebration. Artists painted murals of his face next to Sankara's. Farmers marched with drums. Students danced on university steps holding cardboard signs that read, "We have a captain again." The West, however, reacted differently. In Washington, Paris, Brussels, there were urgent meetings, closed-door strategy sessions, whispered warnings. This was not the script. African leaders were supposed to be malleable, diplomatic, open to partnership. They were not supposed to reject IMF loans, expel foreign troops, or call out multinational corporations for resource exploitation. But that is exactly what Traoré did. He froze mining contracts that had siphoned wealth for decades, redirected tax revenues into local infrastructure, reorganized military command to fight terror without foreign boots on the ground. And perhaps most threatening of all, he gave press conferences without fear, speaking in perfect French, direct and measured with no cue cards. The youth saw him as one of their own. He wore his uniform without medals. He visited schools unannounced. When asked by a foreign reporter if he feared retaliation, he simply replied, "Fear comes when you lie. I do not lie." But every move he made sent tremors through international interests. Defense contractors lost millions overnight. Intelligence analysts flagged him as a non-compliant disruptor. And somewhere in the dark halls of foreign power, a consensus was forming. Ibrahim Traoré needed to be contained. He knew it was coming. He wasn't naive. He had studied history too well. Every generation has its ghost, and those who dare to rise often do not rise for long. But still he accepted the invitation to the Geneva Global Development Summit. Not because he trusted it, because he wanted the world to see his face, not as a rebel, not as a threat, but as a man, a leader who refused to be erased. When his plane took off from Ouagadougou that evening, he looked not out the window but inward. In the seat beside him lay a small black USB drive, unlabeled, unmarked, and heavily encrypted. On it, a 60-second video that could ignite the world. He wasn't sure if he'd use it. He hoped he wouldn't have to. But like every soldier trained in uneven wars, he understood one thing. You don't bring a sword to the battlefield if you don't intend to survive. The email arrived without ceremony, just a clean white background, a gold letterhead banner, and a polite subject line. Official invitation. Geneva Global Development Summit 2025. To the average citizen, it was another routine gathering of world leaders. a chance for handshakes, rehearsed speeches, vague declarations about sustainability and peace. News outlets described it as a historic forum for global cooperation, a photo op, a formality. But those who moved quietly through the halls of influence knew better. This year's summit wasn't about development, it was about alignment. And in the weeks leading up to it, the guest list told a story no headline dared to print. J.D. Vance confirmed his attendance within hours. Not unusual, U.S. representatives often took the podium. But this year, his travel was preceded by weeks of briefings with unnamed committees and flagged reports marked eyes only. Quiet meetings in Virginia, code names like Project Balance, maps of West Africa laid out on polished oak tables, discussions that tiptoed around legality but not intention. Geneva wasn't just a stage, it was a chessboard. And for Vance, it was the moment to make a public move with private weight. Then came the name no one expected. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, the defiant reformer. The wild card from the Sahel had also been invited. No one could say precisely by whom. The summit was hosted under a coalition of development agencies, economic blocs, and private sector partners. The invitation had been unanimous according to the press release, but insiders whispered that his name had been pushed through as part of a calculated strategy. Bring the disruptor into the room, one consultant reportedly said. Then box him in. Some believed the goal was simple diplomacy. Let Traoré speak shake. Some hands extract a few photo ops and watch him walk away softened. Others, however, spoke more cynically. Let him walk into a room full of men who smile as they study his pulse. Let the cameras catch a misstep. Let him overreact, slip, or speak out of turn. Then label him as unstable, unfit extremist. A single headline could do what sanctions failed to. For Traoré, the invitation came with weight. He read it twice, then once more in silence. He knew Geneva would not be a welcome mat, it would be a test. But he accepted immediately. He didn't notify his advisors right away. Instead, he walked the grounds of the presidential compound alone, his boots crunching softly against the gravel path where Sankara once rode his bike. The moon was full, the wind restless. Somewhere a choir practiced in the distance, the melody too faint to follow. He paused under a tree and read the final line of the invitation once more. We look forward to a fruitful dialogue. He smiled not from amusement, but recognition. Dialogue, when controlled, is just another form of dominance. Across the ocean in a black car gliding through the DC night, J.D. Vance was handed a printed list of expected attendees. His eyes scanned the paper methodically until they stopped. Traoré. He didn't blink. He simply turned to his aide and said, "Perfect." The summit was set, the trap laid, the pieces moved into place, and far from the polished stages and prepared applause, a reckoning was quietly en route, dressed in diplomacy, carrying truths not meant to be spoken. The room wasn't marked, it never was. No plaques, no numbers, just a brushed metal door at the end of a private corridor, in a building no tourist would ever notice. It belonged to a law firm technically, but tonight it belonged to something far older and more deliberate, the machinery of empire dressed in modern skin. J.D. Vance arrived precisely at 8:00 p.m. No tie. Navy blazer, open collar, a demeanor polished but unthreatening. He shook hands softly, smiled tightly, sat down at the oval table beneath recessed lighting that never buzzed, never flickered. Across from him sat 7 men and 1 woman, all older, all wealthy in the way that doesn't scream but controls screaming. CEOs of multinational defense firms. A director from a data aggregation giant whose logo colored every American smartphone. 2 retired generals whose pensions were paid twice, once by the government, once by private boards, and 1 man introduced simply as David from offshore, whose accent shifted subtly every hour. A screen at the end of the room blinked awake. The first slide, a map of West Africa, satellite overlays, resource zones, armed movement patterns, color-coded regions. At the center, pulsing red, Burkina Faso. "Let's begin," J.D. said calmly, lacing his fingers. The woman from the defense group cleared her throat. "We've seen a 43% decrease in operational clearance since the Traoré administration canceled joint logistics agreements. We no longer have guaranteed drone corridors. No refueling bases, no infrastructure leverage." Translation, murmured one of the generals, "We're blind in the Sahel." The screen changed copper, uranium, lithium zones. "And resource acquisition?" J.D. asked. Stalled, replied the man from offshore. New export licenses frozen. French contracts revoked. Chinese state bids blocked. The kid is playing hardball. JD leaned back. He's playing nationalism. There was silence for a moment, the kind that feels strategic, not awkward. Then the tech executive spoke. He wasn't old, but he was powerful in ways few understood. We've begun testing counter-narratives on social platforms, framing him as erratic, too militarized, possibly unstable. But it's not sticking. His popularity among African youth is growing. He's smart, media savvy, doesn't rant, doesn't overreach, which makes him dangerous, JD concluded. He stood walking slowly toward the map. With one finger, he traced a circle around Burkina Faso, then widened it to include Mali and Niger. We're not just talking about one country. If Traoré succeeds, he becomes a symbol, a template. And the moment they realize they can say no to us without consequence, it won't stop. David from offshore crossed his arms. So what do you propose, Sanctions JD smiled faintly. Sanctions are loud, obvious, counterproductive. We don't need to punish him. We need to redefine him, delegitimize, isolate, make him someone no respectable institution can touch. That's why Geneva matters. One of the generals frowned. Geneva's a circus. That's the point, JD replied. It's global theater. If he stumbles there, lashes out, contradicts himself, shows even a hint of aggression we frame, it magnify it and discredit the whole movement he represents. He's young. He'll take the bait. And if he doesn't, ask the woman quietly. JD's eyes met hers. Then we escalate, quietly. We have channels in the interior, allies in the old security apparatus, influencers we can fund, elections we can shape, stories we can leak. His voice lowered. Every system has a pressure point, and every man a silence he's afraid to break. There was a long pause. Coffee was poured. A tray of finger food passed around untouched. Finally, David asked, "And you'll confront him directly?" JD didn't blink. "He'll be standing 10 feet from me. I'll know if he flinches." The map dimmed. The room settled into the rustling of chairs and the clink of ceramic. No decisions were made, not formally. They never were in rooms like this. But something had shifted. They were no longer discussing Traoré as a leader. They were treating him as a variable something to be managed, neutralized, and if necessary, erased. As JD walked out into the quiet DC night, his phone buzzed. A message from his senior aide. Geneva moderator approved. Seating confirmed. Your position, center left, directly opposite Traoré. JD stared at the message, then slipped the phone into his pocket. No more theory. No more models. Soon it would be face-to-face. Geneva had never looked more pristine. The Grand Palais International shimmered under the alpine sun, its glass panels catching morning light like polished crystal. Outside, motorcades inched forward, each car sleeker than the last. Journalists from 5 continents lined the barricades, cameras, raised badges swinging on lanyards. Inside, the grand atrium pulsed with soft music, golden lighting, and the soft roar of mingling languages. It was theater diplomacy dressed in gala. The summit's opening ceremony unfolded like a choreographed ballet of protocol and performance. Waitstaff in tuxedos weaved silently through marble corridors. Banners bearing lofty words like progress, unity, and resilience fluttered from the ceiling. Every handshake was rehearsed. Every smile had been practiced in mirrors. JD Vance arrived early. He stepped out of his black sedan with practiced precision, greeted by a Swiss protocol officer with a bow and an earpiece. Cameras flashed. His suit was sharp tie, understated. He waved briefly, eyes flicking to every lens without truly focusing on any of them. He was used to this. He thrived in this. As he entered the hall, he greeted delegates with warmth, old colleagues, ambassadors, tech partners, NGO figureheads. All smiles, all surface. But just beneath the polished pleasantries, a subtle current ran beneath the floor, the anticipation of confrontation. Ibrahim Traoré arrived 37 minutes later without ceremony. No motorcade, no entourage of suited handlers. Just one unmarked diplomatic vehicle and 2 aides. No red carpet, no armada of photographers. His appearance was subdued, but it created a ripple. He wore his military jacket, high-collared and crisp, but without medals. just the flag of Burkina Faso stitched above his chest. His walk was unhurried yet alert, the gait of a man used to both parades and ambushes. As he passed through the entryway, cameras caught up too late, scrambling to capture a figure who wasn't performing. Inside the atrium, Traoré paused. While others admired chandeliers or sought out familiar faces, he watched the staff. The way certain security agents clustered at unnatural intervals. The earpieces, the small drones overhead, the subtle glances between diplomats from 3 specific countries when he stepped into view. He didn't speak. He simply observed, storing patterns the way soldiers do in silence behind the eyes. The opening remarks began. A senior moderator welcomed attendees in English, French, and Arabic. "The world stands at a crossroads," she declared, "and the voices in this room must shape its path forward." Applause followed. Light, polite, meaningless. Then came J.D. Vance. He stepped onto the podium with the poise of a man delivering a verdict. The hall quieted, the lights dimmed slightly, and for a moment there was only his voice. "We gather today not only to collaborate, but to reaffirm what keeps civilization steady. Order, mutual respect. And yes, sometimes difficult decisions. Because in a world of rising threats, fragmented loyalties, and growing extremism, we must remember diplomacy is not about indulgence. It is about discipline." Some clapped, others shifted in their seats. Traoré didn't move. When certain regions, Vance continued, begin to drift from global norms, when they push away cooperation and invite instability, it is not cruelty to act. It is responsibility. The world cannot afford chaos wrapped in idealism. There it was. The sentence wasn't addressed to anyone, but every eye in the room drifted almost involuntarily toward Traoré. He sat still, elbows resting lightly on the arms of his chair, gaze forward, unreadable. He didn't frown. He didn't blink. He simply exhaled slowly, as if filing the words away for later. Vance stepped down to applause. Moderate, measured, but affirming. It was the kind of reaction designed to reassure, to signal to others, "We've drawn the line." But what Vance didn't see, or perhaps chose not to, was the quiet smile that had crept to the corners of Traoré's lips. Not amusement, not approval, but recognition. The game had begun. The corridor was too quiet for coincidence. Carpeted in deep navy with gold trim, lined with towering mirrors and muted artwork, it was the kind of hallway meant to inspire calm and conceal noise. The kind where footsteps disappear into silence, where glances can mean more than words. Ibrahim Traoré didn't like corridors like this. Too elegant, too contained, too easy to control. He walked alone, unhurried, his hands behind his back, absorbing everything. The flicker of motion at the far end. The 2 uniformed guards stationed in seemingly arbitrary places. The subtle, almost imperceptible hum of a surveillance camera mounted just beneath a wall sconce. He knew the space had been chosen, not stumbled into. He had just finished a roundtable discussion: development, infrastructure, youth investment. All the right topics, none of the real substance. He had smiled where needed, nodded where polite. But now his thoughts moved elsewhere. Deeper, to the undercurrent running beneath the summit like a cable of live wire. And then just past the final mirror, he saw him. J.D. Vance, mid-stride, emerging from the West Wing conference room, alone except for a single aide, who quickly peeled away toward the side. Vance stopped when he saw him. Not abruptly, not theatrically, just stopped. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a fractional tightening of the jaw, a quiet centering of balance. For a moment, neither man moved. No handshakes, no small talk, no cameras. Just the 2 of them in that narrow hallway, stripped of stage, stripped of audience, with only the polished marble beneath their feet and the dull reflection of each other in the mirror to the side. Traoré's expression didn't change, neither did Vance's. They simply stood facing each other, a few paces apart, eyes locked in that rare, unfiltered language between adversaries who have already chosen their side. For Traoré, the moment was measured, controlled. He let his gaze do what language could not test. He was searching not for fear, but for intent, the kind of darkness that doesn't shout, but waits, the kind that doesn't rage, but plots. What he saw in J.D. Vance wasn't hatred. It wasn't arrogance. It was calculation. The cold clarity of a man who didn't believe in coincidence, who had already written the script and was now merely watching the actors play their roles. Vance in return looked into the eyes of someone who should have been easier to define. A soldier, a populist, a reformer. Easy labels for press kits. But standing this close, the narrative unraveled. There was no hesitation in Traoré's eyes, no uncertainty. There was something deeper, as if beneath the uniform, behind the calm, he had already seen this exact moment in his mind a dozen times before. And he had already decided how it would end. Neither spoke. There was no need. Every second stretched longer than it should have. The air between them seemed to tighten, compress, hum, with the pressure of unspoken truths. Then, without warning, a group of attendees turned the corner behind them, chattering in French and Spanish, laughing too loudly, unaware of the electric stillness they had interrupted. Traoré stepped aside without looking away. Vance nodded once shallowly, and in an instant the moment fractured. The general walked past first. J.D. Vance turned slowly, watching him disappear down the corridor, his gaze lingering just a second longer than was comfortable. Nothing had been said, but something had changed. The game was no longer being played in speeches or side panels. It had begun in the eyes. And it would end far from this hallway, but never far from this silence. The invitation came folded in thick cream-colored cardstock, discreetly slipped beneath the door of Traoré's suite late in the afternoon. No letterhead, no insignia. Just a line of elegant, cursive, and informal evening drinks and dialogue. Below it, a time, a location, nothing more. Traoré didn't need a briefing to know who was behind it. The Ritz-Carlton's private dining salon on the edge of Lake Geneva had been reserved, but the press didn't know. No media were invited, no photos permitted. The room was set not for spectacle, but for precision. He arrived on time, not early, not late. His uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. 2 aides waited outside as requested. The maitre d' greeted him silently, nodded once, and led him down a quiet corridor lined with vintage Swiss oil paintings and hushed anticipation. Inside the room was dim and luxurious. A long polished oak table, low golden light, 12 chairs, 9 already filled. They stood as he entered. J.D. Vance was among them, glass in hand mid-sentence. He turned casually, as if surprised but not startled, then stepped forward, smile restrained. "President Traoré, we're honored. Please join us." Traoré's eyes moved quickly. He recognized faces from earlier panels, a finance minister from Europe, a tech executive from California, a former West African diplomat turned consultant, and 2 representatives from multilateral lending institutions who rarely appeared at public events. So much for informality. He nodded politely, shook the offered hands, and took the only remaining seat directly across from Vance. Dinner began with wine and pleasantries, discussions of climate strategies, cross-border education, the possibilities of AI in agriculture. Everyone spoke with a softness that almost felt rehearsed. Traoré listened, said little, studied every pause. It wasn't until the dessert plates were cleared and the second glass of wine poured that the tone began to shift. J.D. Vance leaned slightly forward, both hands folded near his untouched creme brulee. "Mr. President, you've made quite an impression this week. The world is watching. It's clear you have a strong vision for your country." Traoré inclined his head slightly. "I appreciate that. And vision," Vance continued, "is important. But vision without structure can drift." A soft murmur of agreement around the table. Neutral, non-committal. Just enough to feel like consensus. "We're all here tonight," Vance said, "because we want to see Burkina Faso succeed. The right way, with support, with partners. Not in isolation, not in defiance of the very systems that make development possible." There it was, the shift from hospitality to calculated message. Another guest chimed in, the banker from Brussels. "We could reopen access to emergency infrastructure funds with a stabilized pathway. Your energy reforms, for example. The potential is vast with the right cooperation." The tech executive added with a performative chuckle, "We've seen what happens when leaders try to go it alone. It's rarely sustainable." Their words were smooth, non-threatening, every sentence phrased as possibility, every condition wrapped in euphemism. But Traoré heard it clearly. This was a wall with velvet on the outside and steel on the inside. He looked at Vance, whose eyes now held a patient gleam, as if waiting for compliance to take form. "Is this what partnership means now?" Traoré said finally, his voice calm. Offers given with one hand while the other carries a ledger, Vance's expression didn't flicker. It's realism. We live in a world of frameworks. Participation has expectations. And sovereignty, Traoré asked. Does that fall within the framework too? A moment of silence followed. The diplomat from the IMF swirled his wine but said nothing. The Californian looked down. The former minister cleared his throat and attempted to change the subject, a question about youth employment, but the silence had already done its work. The illusion of camaraderie cracked. Vance offered a smile. Thin, professional. There are many forms of strength, Mr. President. Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing which battles not to fight. Traoré returned the look, eyes steady. And sometimes the greatest betrayal is calling submission a strategy. The table went quiet again. Moments later, coffee was offered. No one touched it. Traoré stood first. Thank you for the meal. He left without looking back. J.D. Vance remained seated, the light casting a faint shadow across his face. This wasn't over, but the lines had been drawn. The panel was titled New Partnerships for a New Era. The irony didn't go unnoticed. Held in one of the summit's largest conference halls, the room was a semicircle of ivory leather chairs, crystal water glasses, and discreet microphones wired to the translation booths above. 100 delegates filled the rows, flanked by aides, analysts, and silent interpreters, wearing expressionless headsets. Cameras rolled from the back, not live-streamed but archived. Everything said here would live forever. Ibrahim Traoré sat calmly between a North African finance minister and a South Korean trade envoy. Across from him, as expected, sat J.D. Vance, leaning slightly to one side, fingers loosely clasped, as if resting between lines of a well-rehearsed script. The moderator welcomed everyone, recited the agenda, then invited the panel to speak about leveraging international cooperation for sustainable reform. J.D. Vance spoke first. We must recognize, he began smoothly, that development doesn't happen in isolation. No nation, no matter how noble its goals, can succeed by retreating inward. True growth, he said, pausing for emphasis, requires collaboration, compromise, and respect for the global system that has enabled unprecedented peace and prosperity. Applause followed, polite expected. Then came the subtle cut. Of course, when a government chooses to operate outside these structures, when it rejects assistance and begins to prioritize ideology over accountability, we have to ask, who are they really serving? There was no mention of Burkina Faso, no mention of Traoré, but the room turned toward him. The moderator smiled nervously. President Traoré, would you like to respond? He didn't rush. He never did. Burkina Faso believes in cooperation, he began, his voice even. We believe in partnership in trade and dialogue, but true partnership is built on mutual respect, not leverage, not contracts drafted to benefit only one party, not aid tied to political obedience, and certainly not strategies written in distant rooms meant to dictate how our people live, govern, or dream. A few heads nodded cautiously. Others remained very still. Vance's face tightened. President Traoré, he said, leaning in slightly, we've seen leaders before, especially young, charismatic ones, who arrive with promises of transformation, but leave behind broken economies and fractured alliances. The world isn't doubting your passion, but passion isn't policy. And rhetoric, he added, isn't governance. The jab landed. The room grew quieter, but Traoré didn't flinch. Mr. Vance, he said with quiet clarity, I did not come here to play hero. I came to represent a people who are tired of being told that survival is only possible through dependence. I came because we are building something not against the world, but for ourselves. And if that is threatening to those who once controlled our destiny, then perhaps it is not us who should reflect on our direction. J.D. Vance sat straighter. The warmth drained from his expression. You speak of independence, he replied, but your country is currently under economic duress, facing security challenges, and by some accounts being influenced by regimes whose interests are far from democratic. The accusation was clear, and finally Traoré said the words that cut through every layer of protocol, Burkina Faso is not for sale. The room froze, no translation needed. The sentence echoed across booths, headsets, and continents. For a few long seconds, nothing moved. Then a single camera flash, then another. Vance remained still, but his eyes narrowed. The moderator attempted to soften the tension, pivoting to a question about public-private partnerships, but the mood had shifted. The room felt sharper now, divided, as if the summit script had suddenly gone off book. Traoré sat back, folded his hands gently, and said nothing more. He had already said enough. The hallway outside Suite 1907 was empty. Quiet, polished, pristine, the kind of silence that wrapped itself around marble walls and muffled even the sharpest heel clicks. But at precisely 2:14 a.m., a shadow passed the hallway camera. Then another. They didn't knock. Two men dressed in dark suits moved with surgical precision. No badges, no names. One carried a slim black pouch, the other a tablet looping the hotel's internal security system. Neither spoke. They bypassed the door lock in under 6 seconds. Inside, the lights were off, the room untouched, curtains drawn, slippers by the bed. A hardcover book left open on the armchair, as if its reader had just stepped into the bathroom and would be back any moment. It was staged to look lived in, but something felt wrong. They moved quickly but carefully. The bed was scanned, not touched. The safe was opened empty. Suitcase zipped, unzipped, zipped again. A toothbrush unused. The minibar still sealed. They moved to the desk, then to the nightstand. One man checked behind the large mirror. The other opened the closet. No clothes, no scent of aftershave, no sign of sleep. And then they paused. The room wasn't occupied. It never had been. 3 floors below, Ibrahim Traoré stood barefoot on the hotel's rooftop terrace, his uniform jacket draped over the back of a chair collar, open to the night air. Geneva glittered below him, 1,000 golden lights flickering across the lakeside like reflections of stars. The city was still. The wind was cold. He didn't seem to notice. He wasn't surprised. From the moment he'd stepped onto Swiss soil, he'd known there would be a moment like this. Not confrontation in a debate room. Not a press ambush. Something quieter, more precise. It always came at night. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a slim satellite phone, not connected to local towers, untraceable by standard networks. He unlocked it with a code only he knew, then pressed one button. It rang only once before being answered. We don't hear what he says. No names are spoken, no countries mentioned. Just the sound of his voice, low, focused, measured, flowing across encrypted lines to someone listening thousands of miles away. The conversation lasts less than a minute. Then he ends the call, places the phone back in his coat, and picks up a small black object from the table, a USB drive. Slim, matte, unmarked. He turns it once in his hand, then pockets it without a word. Behind him, Geneva sleeps, but not for long. Far below, the men leave Suite 1907 as silently as they came. They don't speak as they exit through the service corridor. There's nothing to report, at least not officially, and yet when they disappear into the darkened hallway, there's a flicker of uncertainty in their pace, the faintest hint that maybe they weren't the hunters tonight. On the rooftop, Traoré takes one last look over the city. Then he walks away, jacket over his arm, eyes steady. Something is coming, and this time he will not be the one caught off guard. The second day of the summit began under an unusually clouded Geneva sky. The light had softened into a gray wash over the city's polished skyline, and the mood inside the Palais des Nations carried the same weight, heavy, uncertain, expectant. Delegates filed into the plenary chamber, murmuring greetings, clutching coffee cups and folios, unaware that the script for the day was about to be torn apart. J.D. Vance arrived 15 minutes early. His demeanor was precise, suit flawless, smile restrained. But behind his eyes, something sharper flickered, the look of a man about to pull a trigger. He took his seat center right on the stage platform, adjusted his microphone, and glanced once at the empty seat across from him. Traoré was not yet in the room. Perfect. The moderator, clearly following new instructions, announced a schedule change. Before we proceed with today's regional dialogue, she said cautiously, Senator Vance has requested to make a formal statement. The cameras swiveled in unison. Delegates turned in their seats. Vance stood. Thank you, Madam Chair, he began, voice steady, slow. It is with great reluctance and great responsibility that I speak today, not just as a representative of my nation, but as a guardian of this institution's credibility. He paused, allowing the words to settle. Over the past months, certain patterns of destabilization have emerged across West Africa. The international community has watched with growing concern, and now evidence has come to light that a sitting delegate at this very summit has, through both covert and overt actions, contributed to the escalation of civil unrest, the obstruction of humanitarian access, and the cultivation of foreign military influence on sovereign soil. A sharp murmur swept across the chamber. This delegate, Vance said, has acted not in the spirit of dialogue, but in defiance of it. He has rejected cooperation, embraced radical actors, and created a dangerous precedent for rebellion disguised as reform. Gasps were audible now. Heads turned, phones lifted. The room was tilting on the edge of something electric. Then the final blow, I speak, of course, of President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. The air fractured. At that exact moment, the chamber doors opened and Traoré stepped in. He didn't rush, didn't fumble. He walked with the same grounded calm that had carried him through war zones, parades, and now political minefields. The timing was uncanny, or perhaps deliberate. He met Vance's gaze mid-step. Vance did not look away. Given the weight of this intelligence, Vance continued, and in the interest of maintaining the summit's integrity, I formally request that President Traoré be suspended from all panel discussions, removed from official sessions, and escorted from the venue under Article 4 of Emergency Protocol. There was a stunned silence. Article 4 was rarely invoked a diplomatic nuke. It allowed for the expulsion of any delegate found to be a threat to collective security or order. Its use would send global headlines into orbit. The moderator looked frozen. Aides scrambled in the background. Whispering broke out in multiple languages. Traoré stood still now, just steps from the podium. He didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, his eyes scanned the room. Delegates from Ghana, Mali, Brazil, the EU. Some looked away, some leaned forward. A few stared openly, uncertain whether to side with protocol or justice. Vance remained standing, hands folded before him, like a priest delivering bad news. "We cannot," he said, "allow this institution to be used as a shield for those who reject the values we claim to protect." The line was rehearsed, polished, designed for headlines, but there was something brittle beneath it now, a quiet sense that Vance had crossed from diplomacy into something else, something personal. Traoré stepped forward once more slowly as security guards entered quietly from both sides of the room. They didn't touch him, not yet, but their presence said what Vance didn't have to. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a removal, a purge. And in that still, breathless moment, the world leaned in, waiting to see whether the young general from West Africa would comply, protest, or ignite something none of them could control. The silence was thick enough to bend light. In the grand chamber of the Palais, where voices usually danced through translation booths and shuffled papers, filled the gaps between speeches, there was only the sound of movement, slow, deliberate, unmistakable. Two security officers entered from opposite ends of the room. They weren't wearing riot gear or armed in view, but the message was clear. Their posture was official, rehearsed. Their steps measured. One moved toward the main aisle, the other flanked the side entrance. 1,000 eyes followed them. Cameras turned, phones lifted. News reporters seated in the second gallery leaned forward with sudden alertness. Fingers dancing over touchscreens, mouths forming silent words to their remote producers. Something's happening. Now. J.D. Vance remained standing near the stage, hands clasped in front of him, expression composed as though he hadn't just detonated a diplomatic bombshell. Ibrahim Traoré, still at the edge of the central aisle, watched the guards approach. He didn't blink, didn't raise a hand, didn't flinch. He stood as if carved from something ancient and unmoved. The officers stopped 3 feet from him. One extended a hand, not touching, just gesturing. "Mr. President," the man said carefully, "we'll need you to step outside with us." It was a request only in form, not in spirit. The cameras were rolling now. Live feeds beamed from phones, shoulder-mounted rigs, embassy media crews, all catching the moment from different angles. One woman from the press whispered, "Oh my God," as her lens zoomed tighter. Traoré didn't speak. Not yet. He let the moment stretch, not in defiance, but in understanding. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing against the walls, demanding a reaction. Instead, he looked slowly from one guard to the other. Then his eyes moved up to the press gallery, to the delegates frozen in their seats, to the glass window, at the back where translators hovered mid-sentence waiting. Finally, he turned his head just enough to meet J.D. Vance's gaze across the room. Vance didn't move. And then Traoré spoke, his voice calm, deep, unhurried. "Are you sure you want to do this? On camera?" The words cut through the room like a knife through silk. Not loud, not threatening, but surgical, calculated. A few delegates shifted in their seats. A murmur passed like wind through dry grass. One of the guards hesitated. It was subtle, a half-second pause, the tiniest shift in footing. But it was there, enough to show that the question had pierced through the protocol. Traoré wasn't resisting. He was challenging the optics. This wasn't a quiet backdoor expulsion anymore. This was spectacle, theater. And every lens in the room was now a witness, a global audience ready to decide who the villain was. J.D. Vance's jaw tightened. He stepped forward half a pace, adjusting his stance like a man steadying for recoil. "This is not about theatrics, Mr. Traoré. It's about responsibility." Traoré tilted his head slightly. "Then perhaps the responsible thing," he said, eyes locked with the camera now, "is to let the world hear what I have to say before deciding who to escort out." The room stirred. From the rear, one of the media correspondents began live streaming without filters. A journalist from Ghana whispered into her mic, "President Traoré is facing removal as tensions rise." "Wait, he's speaking." The moderator, flustered, tapped the mic. "We will take a short recess while this is." But it was already too late. The cameras had captured the moment. Not a man being led away, but a leader standing still while others scrambled to control the narrative. Traoré remained silent again, but the shift had already begun. This wasn't just political anymore. It was personal, and what followed would not be edited, filtered, or softened. The world was now watching in real time. The guards took a step forward. This time, no hesitation. One extended his hand again. The other motioned silently toward the exit. The protocol had shifted from request to action. Everyone in the room felt it, the weight of inevitability beginning to descend like fog on glass. And then Ibrahim Traoré moved. Slowly, purposefully. No sudden gestures, no panic. Just a measured slide of his right hand into the inner pocket of his coat. The guard's tensed eyes, narrowing fingers, twitching instinctively toward radios. Even a diplomat's stillness could be mistaken in a moment like this. But Traoré wasn't reaching for defense. He was reaching for something heavier. A USB drive, matte black, unmarked. He held it in two fingers, as if offering nothing more than a pen. Then he turned toward the moderator, who stood frozen, just off-center, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. "Madam Chair," he said evenly, "before I am removed from this stage, I ask only this." He stepped forward, holding the device out toward her. "Play this." His voice didn't waver. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement, clean, clear, deliberate. The moderator blinked, hesitated, then took the USB with a shaking hand. "What is this?" Truth Traoré replied. "Let the world decide who threatens peace." Gasps echoed in the chamber. One reporter in the gallery dropped his phone. A translator dropped her pen. Vance's face froze, the mask of control cracking for the first time. His mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came. He took one step forward, then stopped. "I strongly advise against playing," but the moderator had already turned. She gestured to the technician seated behind the central desk. The USB was plugged in, projected onto the main screen above the delegates' heads. The feed flickered. Then it played. The video opened with grainy footage, time-stamped locked room footage. A conference table. J.D. Vance seated at its head. Beside him, two men from an energy conglomerate, one from a private security firm, and a former ambassador. The audio, though slightly muffled, was unmistakable. "We won't get stability by asking nicely," Vance said. "We create the instability we need, then offer to solve it." The room went still. "Burkina Faso is step one," he continued. "We break their leverage, block trade corridors, fund opposition figures, collapse one sector, then offer a rescue plan." The video showed him tapping a map with his finger, the same map presented at the closed-door meeting just days earlier. His voice was steady, unapologetic. "The kid thinks he's a revolutionary. He won't last." A hushed wave rolled through the crowd like wind passing through a field. Some delegates looked down. Others looked at Vance. But no one looked away from the screen. The footage lasted less than 60 seconds. 60 seconds that erased months of diplomacy. 60 seconds that reframed everything. As the video ended, the screen went dark. There was no applause, no movement, only silence. And in that silence stood Ibrahim Traoré, not restrained, not removed, but still. Unmoved. The guards no longer reached for him. The cameras were still rolling. And J.D. Vance, once the man orchestrating every move, now stood center stage beneath a burning spotlight, surrounded not by allies but witnesses. The screen stayed black for one breath, two, and then flickered back to life. The recording began again, this time in full. Uncut, unedited. The same scene from the short clip that had just shaken the chamber, now shown in its entirety. A dimly lit conference room, no identifying emblems, no press. The camera angle was slightly tilted, positioned just behind a hanging light fixture in the corner of the ceiling. The quality wasn't pristine, but it didn't need to be. Faces were clear, voices unmistakable. J.D. Vance sat at the head of the table, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. Gone was the polished statesman. In his place sat the strategist, calculated, clinical, devoid of caution. To his right, an executive from a multinational oil conglomerate. To his left, a gray-haired man from a private defense firm, arms folded, saying nothing but absorbing everything. The others around the table shifted in and out of the frame, some clearly familiar, others less so. All powerful, all listening. "We're not going to win the future with soft hands," Vance said. "We've tried cooperation, soft diplomacy, goodwill. That narrative doesn't work anymore. It's too slow, too clean." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "We need to reset the balance before the multipolar crowd gets too confident. That means leverage. That means disruption. That means hitting the weak points before they get reinforced." He tapped the table 3 times methodically. Burkina Faso is the template. Young, defiant leadership, high-value resources, no loyalty to the dollar. That's a fire waiting to be sparked. The oil executive spoke, his voice low but audible. "You're suggesting active destabilization?" Vance smiled. A small one. Crooked. "We won't need boots on the ground," he said. Then clearly, coldly, "Just weaken the spine." In the chamber you could hear a pin drop. Delegates stared unmoving. Some blinked slowly as if trying to process the reality of what they were witnessing. Others looked not at the screen, but at Vance, who stood motionless, his jaw set, hands clenched just out of sight. On screen, the conversation continued. "We block trade lanes through joint task force drills, stage them as anti-terror ops, increase economic friction through targeted delays, compliance, red tape, shipping licenses, logistics bottlenecks." It's boring but effective. The room shifted slightly as someone poured a drink. Glass clinked. Then more voices joined. "And if he pushes back, he will," Vance said. "But that's where we get creative. Fund opposition networks. Float anonymous stories. Question his background, his capacity. Youth is a gift until we decide it's a liability. And if that doesn't work, a pause." Then Vance flatly, "Then we isolate him. Discredit the government entirely. By the time we're done, they'll beg us to intervene." He looked directly at someone off frame and added, "Give me 90 days and I can turn any country into a cautionary tale." The video ended there. No fade out, just a hard cut to black. For several seconds, the chamber remained suspended in a surreal kind of quiet. No whispers, no shuffle of paper. Just the breathing of men and women caught between outrage and paralysis. And then, as if breaking from a spell, one delegate stood. The representative from Namibia. Then another, Senegal. Then Bolivia. Not a protest, not a performance. Just silent recognition. The way people stand for truth when they have no words strong enough to carry it. J.D. Vance didn't move. His face was pale now, stone carved too tightly around the mouth, eyes scanning not the screen, but the reactions. He knew. He knew the clip would be streamed within minutes, that phones were already sending it to newsrooms, private channels, intelligence briefings. The damage wasn't theoretical anymore. It was kinetic, rolling, irreversible, and in the center of it all, still as ever, stood Ibrahim Traoré. He hadn't spoken since the clip ended. He didn't need to. His silence now said more than any victory speech could. The room wasn't looking at him as a rebel anymore. They were looking at him as the only man who hadn't lied. For a moment it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Inside the chamber, the silence was no longer tension, it was disbelief. The kind of silence that usually follows a tragedy or a revelation. A soundless acknowledgement that something had broken and nothing would go back to the way it was. All eyes turned to J.D. Vance. The camera lens panned to him in real time, a tight close-up that broadcast across internal monitors, live streams and satellite feeds, feeding into newsrooms around the globe. He was standing still but not steady. His face was pale lips, slightly parted as if he'd been caught mid-thought and forgot the rest of the sentence. No aide came to his side. No voice rose to defend him. He was frozen, exposed, and for the first time in the entire summit, utterly, visibly alone. Around him, delegates looked from screen to screen, then to each other. Some whispered to their aides. Some sat back with hands on their mouths. Others, like the EU Trade Commissioner and the Brazilian Environmental Minister, simply stared at the floor, unwilling to meet the gaze of a man they had once applauded the day before. Anger came first, not from the stage but the seats, a low, audible murmur growing sharper by the second. He said that, on record, is this real? This is sabotage of democracy itself. Traoré remained still, arms behind his back. He had not moved since the screen went dark. There was no need to gesture, no call for applause. His calm now echoed louder than Vance's entire speech earlier that morning. And then outside the room, the second explosion began. Social media erupted. What began as a handful of live streams from reporters in the chamber turned into a tidal wave of outrage within minutes. Hashtags spread like wildfire. Chuck Vance exposed. Sir, we're weak in the spine. Burkina, not for sale. Nasha's 60 seconds of truth. A 42-second screen recording of the video posted by a journalist from Nairobi hit 4.3 million views in the first 17 minutes. Another post by a French student activist captioned, "He really said that," with his whole chest, gathered over 2 million likes in less than an hour. Within the hour, TikTok, Twitter, X, Instagram, and WhatsApp groups across the African diaspora were flooded with clips, reaction videos, side-by-side comparisons of J.D. Vance's public statements versus the secret footage. In Accra, students gathered around a cafe projector replaying the video and erupting with shouts. In Johannesburg, the phrase, "we won't need boots on the ground," trended alongside neo-colonialism exposed. In Paris, protesters who had been planning a rally on fuel hikes changed their banners to read, "You won't break our spine." At the White House, press aides scrambled to form a statement. Phones rang off the hook in congressional offices. Private group chats between lobbyists, former ambassadors, and corporate executives lit up with one-liners and panicked questions. Did he really say that? Was that room bugged? Can we spin this inside the chamber? Someone finally moved. It was the delegate from Chile who stood slowly and said into his live mic, "Madam Chair, I propose that we immediately suspend Senator Vance from all further proceedings until an independent investigation can be completed." No one objected. No one dared. The moderator simply nodded. Vance didn't respond. He hadn't spoken a word since the footage ended. His jaw clenched. His eyes darted once to the exit, then back to the screen, still frozen on his own face mid-sentence, captured forever in digital infamy. And in the gallery above, a young woman from Al Jazeera, still recording, whispered into her mic, "History doesn't always happen with fireworks. Sometimes it happens with a sentence caught on tape, whispered in secret, and played for the world to hear." And far from Geneva and cafes and living rooms, classrooms and markets, people kept watching. Because they had just seen what power looked like when it told the truth by accident. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the screen finally went black. No applause, no protocol. Just silence, thick with the weight of truth. Everyone remained seated, frozen in a stunned stillness that made time feel suspended. The air was heavy, not with chaos, but reckoning. J.D. Vance hadn't moved. He stood rooted in place, lips pressed into a hard-lined jaw, tight enough to crack. His hands were clenched behind his back knuckles, white. The aura of control that had surrounded him for so long, impenetrable, almost mythic, had fractured. The myth had bled. And across from him stood the man he had tried to reduce to a symbol, a problem, a variable in a strategy. Ibrahim Traoré turned his eyes toward him one last time. Calm, no triumph in his expression, no gloating, just something colder, older, a quiet sense of knowing. He held the stare not long, but long enough. Then softly, so that only those nearby could hear, but the cameras still caught it, he spoke. You tried to bury us. You forgot we were seeds. The words, simple and rooted in African proverb, landed like a final bell in a match already decided. Somewhere in the audience, someone exhaled audibly. A few turned toward Traoré, not as observers, but as witnesses. The silence cracked not with sound, but with meaning. Security didn't move. The two officers who had stood poised at the aisle now relaxed. One even took a half-step back. They had been told to escort a man out of the building, but now they understood this man was walking out on his own terms. The moderator didn't say a word. No one asked him to stay. No one could ask him to leave. Traoré turned. His steps were slow, deliberate, grounded. He didn't hurry. He didn't glance back. As he passed the front row of delegates, a few stood instinctively, not in protest, not in solidarity, in respect. A silent act that rippled across the room like a wave of conscience awakening from slumber. First the delegate from Ghana, then Mali, then Brazil, then Slovenia. Not all stood, but enough did to change the tone of the room entirely. By the time Traoré reached the doors, the chamber was no longer divided between East and West, North and South, reformer and establishment. It was divided between those who had spoken truth and those who had spent too long avoiding it. He paused once at the threshold, not to pose, but to mark the moment. A quiet turn of the head, a last breath of the room, a leader leaving not expelled, but elevated. Then he stepped into the corridor beyond the chamber. The doors closed behind him with a gentle click, like the closing of a chapter that would never be reopened the same way again. Outside, the corridors were buzzing, aides on phones, journalists scrambling, delegations whispering, sprinting, reassembling, strategy in real time. But none of that touched him. He moved through it all like a man beyond the storm, untouched, unbent. And as he stepped into the sunlight spilling through the western windows, the light caught just enough to cast his silhouette long across the floor. No guards flanked him, no escort directed him, and yet everyone made way. He had entered Geneva as a question mark. He was leaving as an answer. The first tremor hit Washington, D.C. before sunrise. By 5:42 a.m. Eastern, the Geneva footage had reached every major newsroom in the capital. Within hours, it wasn't just a trending story, it was the story. The scandal didn't break like a wave. It detonated like a mine beneath the surface of American politics. At 6:07 a.m., the first official inquiry was filed by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. By 6:28 a.m., J.D. Vance's name was trending on every major platform right next to the Traoré truth and weaken the spine. By 7:00 a.m., cameras had gathered outside his townhouse in Georgetown. He never came out. The White House press secretary took the podium at 8:15 a.m., visibly shaken and tightly scripted. The administration was unaware of the comments made by Senator Vance in the footage. We fully support an immediate ethics review, and we condemn any actions that undermine international trust or violate diplomatic norms. Translation, he's on his own. Inside Capitol Hill, phones rang off the hook. Staffers pulled all-nighters scrubbing old emails and reviewing call logs. Lobbyists once confident and smug now requested off-the-record meetings. Defense contractors sent emergency communiques to legal teams, and the PR firms that had once polished Vance's image began distancing themselves by the hour. By mid-morning, 3 senators, 2 from his own party, had called for his temporary suspension from committee duties pending investigation. The term pending was a placeholder. Everyone could read the air. The political temperature had shifted, and no one wanted to get burned. Vance was politically radioactive. Cable news anchors who once invited him weekly now referred to him in the past tense. Headlines grew more brutal by the hour. The senator who wanted to weaken Africa's spine. Private power, public shame. America's new colonial crisis. Editorial boards sharpened their knives. One op-ed from the New York Times read, "We are witnessing the unmasking of a man who mistook strategy for integrity and found himself exposed not by force but by truth." The most brutal part, his allies said nothing. The donors, the think tanks, the media personalities who once cheered his hardline realism all went silent. Not one statement of support, not one appearance on his behalf. Even the party leadership refused to defend him. A senior member, when asked by reporters, simply said, "I think he'll need time to reflect on his future." Reflection was all he had. Inside his townhouse, blinds-drawn security posted, J.D. Vance sat at a kitchen table, littered with briefing memos, cold coffee, and unopened legal documents. His phone vibrated every minute, emails, missed calls, incoming headlines. He didn't answer any of them. He stared instead at the paused video on a laptop screen, his own face frozen mid-sentence, the words still echoing in his ears. Just weaken the spine. He had rehearsed those words in private once. They had felt clever then, surgical, strategic. He'd believed them, still did perhaps. But now the world saw them differently. Not as strategy, but as cruelty, and worse, as policy. In the distance, helicopters circled. Not military ones. News crews. He closed the laptop. Outside, a reporter called into the mic. "We still have no official statement from the senator." Inside, J.D. Vance leaned back in his chair. The room felt smaller now, the walls closer, the world quieter. Not because it had forgiven him, but because it had already moved on. By the time Ibrahim Traoré's plane touched down in Ouagadougou, the airstrip was lined with people. There had been no official call for a welcome, no televised campaign, no government directive, but word had spread fast and far. Thousands came, young, old, farmers, students, women carrying flags, men in faded uniforms, children on shoulders chanting his name like a drumbeat. Traoré, Traoré, Traoré. Not since the early days of Sankara had Burkina Faso seen a homecoming like this. And it wasn't just here. In Dakar, university students played his Geneva speech over Bluetooth speakers during protests against IMF restrictions. In Lagos, a mural went up overnight, Traoré's silhouette beneath bold red letters, "We are not for sale." In Nairobi, a poetry slam finalist opened with the now famous line, "They tried to bury us, but we were seeds." Presidents and ministers across the continent, from Accra to Windhoek, began quoting him in interview summits and parliament halls. Some cautiously, some proudly, but all repeating him. His words had cut through the fog of diplomacy and reached something deeper, a collective memory of struggle and a quiet yearning for self-definition. Yet through it all, Traoré remained remarkably silent. He didn't declare victory. He didn't tweet triumph. He didn't bask in applause. He listened. He met with elders, walked through markets, sat with students in makeshift lecture halls. In private, he warned his ministers, "This attention isn't power, it's pressure." Still, the world wanted to hear from him. And so 1 week after Geneva, he gave them something. Not a spectacle. A speech, short, unscripted, spoken from a wooden podium in front of a dusty courtyard where farmers had gathered for a food distribution initiative. No flags, no orchestra, no grand entrance. Just a microphone, a breeze, and his voice. "I did not win anything in Geneva." He began quietly. "I did not defeat anyone. I simply told the truth in a room where it had been forgotten." He paused. "Burkina Faso is not alone. Africa is not alone. We are not poor, we are plundered. We are not helpless, we are unheard. And yet still we rise." The crowd leaned in, not roaring, but absorbing. "This is not about anger," he continued. "It is about memory, about dignity, about unity that cannot be bought or broken. Our future will not come from permission. It will come from purpose." Then more softly, "I did not go to Geneva to provoke. I went to be present. And now the world has seen us not as victims, but as voices." There was no dramatic end, no hand to the heart, no anthem. He stepped back, nodded to the crowd, and walked down the wooden steps as simply as he had come. But the effect was profound. In the days that followed, African youth took that speech and turned it into something more. Video mashups with music subtitles in 6 languages. Hashtags like Jarash, Rise Africa, Ashash, Purpose Not Permission, and Geneva Line trended from Kigali to Atlanta. What Traoré had sparked wasn't a movement in the traditional sense. It was something quieter but far more powerful, a shift in posture. A new way of standing, not as recipients of aid, but as authors of destiny. And across the continent, from dusty villages to bustling capitals, one thing had become clear: Africa was not waiting anymore. The townhouse was quiet. Outside, the press had dwindled. The headlines had moved on to the next outrage, the next leak, the next crisis. But inside, the silence had settled into the walls like dust, thick, unmoving, inescapable. J.D. Vance sat at the small desk in his study, a legal pad before him, the edges curled from a humid night. He held a pen but hadn't touched the page yet. His right hand hovered just above it, uncertain. The room was lined with the remnants of a life built on image. Books with his name on the spine, framed headlines from his Senate victory, photographs with governors, diplomats, a smiling shot beside the president. All of it now dulled by scandal, by footage replayed a million times online. By 60 seconds, that had changed everything. And yet none of that was what brought him to the desk. He wasn't writing to the public, nor to the Senate, nor to his shattered party. He was writing to his father, or trying to. The page was blank except for 2 words scribbled with hesitation: "Dad, sorry." He stared at them for a long time. The word sorry looked strange. He had said it before mechanically, diplomatically, but this time it felt foreign, fragile, as if saying it here now made it real in a way that a press statement never could. He imagined his father's voice, the gravelly laugh, the rough hands that built fences and poured concrete, the man who had little patience for politics but taught him that a man's word meant something, especially when no one was watching. Would he have understood? Would he have forgiven? Or would he have looked at his son and asked quietly, "What were you thinking?" J.D. shifted in his chair. He thought about the Geneva room, the lights, the silence, the way Traoré had looked at him, not with hatred, but with clarity, as if he had already seen the ending and was simply waiting for J.D. to catch up. "You tried to bury us. You forgot we were seeds." That line had haunted him more than anything else, not because it was clever, but because it was true. He'd convinced himself it was strategy, just policy, just the game. But now, stripped of the podium, the donors, the spin, he was left with something he hadn't expected. Regret. Not for being caught, but for what it had taken to feel caught at all. His hand moved again slowly. He wrote a second line. "I thought I was building something that mattered." He stared at it, then crossed it out. Too defensive. Too easy. He tried again. "Maybe I mistook control for wisdom," then stopped. He set the pen down. The silence pressed closer. In the corner of the room sat a small wooden box, his father's old toolkit. He hadn't touched it in years. Inside were rusted pliers, a dented hammer, a steel measuring tape with the numbers faded at the edges. He stood and opened it, ran a hand over the cracked leather handle of the hammer. The weight of it was familiar. Real. Heavy in a way that truth often was. Back at the desk, the legal pad waited, but he didn't return to it. Instead, he walked to the window, looked out over the street. He no longer walked. The reporters were gone, but the silence remained. He never finished the letter. He folded the page, slipped it between the pages of a closed book, and returned to his seat. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he finally understood why it mattered. 1 year later, the world had changed. Not in revolutions or headlines, but in tone, in the way people spoke of power, sovereignty, and truth. It was on a cool, quiet morning that Ibrahim Traoré agreed to a rare televised interview. No podium, no crowd, just a plain chair beneath soft lighting and a single camera. The journalist welcomed him gently. "You've become a symbol. Some call you a hero, others a disruptor. What do you call yourself?" Traoré smiled faintly. "I call myself tired." They both chuckled, but the truth sat underneath. He didn't radiate triumph. He carried something heavier. Carrying the hope of millions, he said, is heavier than gold, and far more fragile. He spoke not of Geneva, but of the months that followed. The pressure, the threats, the rebuilding of trust, not between nations, but between a government and its people. He refused to frame what happened as a personal victory. "It was not about me," he said. "I only stood where the world was already looking. The courage came from the people. I was just the mirror." Before the interview ended, the journalist asked one final question. "If you could go back, would you do it the same way?" Traoré looked into the lens, not at the journalist, but through it, as if speaking to someone far beyond the studio. "I would speak even sooner." In Ghana, a 14-year-old girl named Adjoa watched Traoré's speech on her mother's phone. She didn't understand every word, but she understood enough. She wrote his final quote into the back of her math notebook beneath her homework: "They forgot we were seeds." In Senegal, Professor Mamadou Ndiaye paused mid-lecture to show the full Geneva footage to his political science class. When it ended, he asked, "What did this moment give you?" One student replied, "Permission to stop being afraid of telling the truth." In Georgia, USA, 68-year-old civil rights veteran Harold Foster sat on his porch watching the Geneva video on an old tablet. He smiled, then whispered, "Finally." Someone remembered what it's supposed to mean to stand tall. They had never met Traoré, but he had spoken to each of them, not through grand speeches or polished PR, but through presence, dignity, and the willingness to say out loud what so many had learned to bury. Across continents, his actions had become not just political, but personal. They reminded people of something they'd quietly stopped believing, that justice was still possible. That power didn't have to be purchased. That courage, when spoken clearly, could outlast fear. He didn't give them slogans. He gave them permission to remember their own voice. The clip began again. No music, no editing. Just the raw, quiet footage that had changed everything. J.D. Vance sat at the head of the table, surrounded by oil executives and a defense contractor. His voice was calm, calculated. "We won't need boots on the ground. Just weaken the spine." The line echoed not through the room but through the world. It had once been said in secret. Now it was public record. Then the screen shifted. Ibrahim Traoré, standing tall in Geneva, holding a small USB in his hand. He spoke clearly without raising his voice. "Let the world decide who threatens peace." And for one long moment, the room was silent. No one moved, because something had changed. Power had shifted not through violence or force, but through truth. The footage ended, but people kept watching. Some moments pass, others stay. That one stayed. It reminded the world that dignity matters, that silence can be broken, and that sometimes just 1 minute of truth is stronger than years of lies. Traoré didn't celebrate. He simply walked out of the summit, calm and steady, a man who had said what needed to be said and let the world choose what came next. Sometimes the most powerful act is not shouting louder, but standing still in truth. Traoré didn't fight power with rage. He exposed it with calm dignity and courage. In a world where silence often protects the powerful, his voice reminded us integrity still matters. What would you do if the whole world was watching and you had just 60 seconds to speak the truth? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.